So welcome to the class on Behavioral Finance for CFA Level 3 for Life Instructor Mumbai. As a part of the online module, you will have over 100 hours of interactive sessions like these. All of you will be provided with recorded videos of the classrooms. 8 topic level tests, 4 fill-in tests, a question bank of over 2,000 questions, and essay type papers of all the previously conducted exams will be provided as a part of the program. So we'll start with one of the most important topics tested extensively both on the morning session, which is the essay type session, as well as on the item set part in the afternoon. So behavioral finance as an area of finance is relatively grey. It is vast, it is fast evolving. More and more theories are being developed as we speak. The CFA curriculum itself has seen a lot of churn on the section on behavioral finance. So different theories have come, different theories have been adopted and changed by the institute. So before we start on to understand what behavioral finance tries to tell us, let's go back and review what we learned as a part of traditional finance. So what have we learned as a part of level 1 and level 2? Now if you notice, traditional finance up till now has been prescriptive in nature. So why prescriptive? We were told that if the correlation between assets is such, that means the risk is such, so you should buy the security or sell the security. So if the fair value is less than the market price, short the security. If the fair value is higher than the market price, long. So in its approach, traditional finance is prescriptive. It advocates that, or it hinges on the assumption that investors are risk averse. That is, they would prefer the investment with the lowest risk given an equal amount of return. Investors in the market exist to maximize the utility of risk, or maximize their utility. We'll define more descriptively what utility means. So utility essentially is the satisfaction or benefit that you derive. It doesn't necessarily have units. So investors try to maximize their utility. Expectations are unbiased. That is, investors can agree or disagree with the riskiness of stocks. So we may all feel that a particular stock is more risky or another stock is less risky, but all of us agree on that. So all of us have unbiased expectations about the different assets we invest in. Markets are assumed to be efficient. That is, a large number of profit maximizing investors are continuously valuing and analyzing stocks. Moreover, information comes to the market in a random fashion and is immediately adjusted in investor estimates. So in summary, traditional finance assumes a rational economic man, a man who understands the various aspects of investing and applies them in the process of portfolio management. Now we all know that, or we can all imagine to an extent that this is too restrictive, or it assumes a little too much ideality in the process of investing. So now there are different biases, some of which that we can imagine, some of which that we can't, or that we will study as a part of the curriculum. But we all know that this is too restrictive, and that is why not everyone is able to make money. So everyone could do CFA and make a lot of money in the market if traditional finance were to make stocks behave the way they do. So there's something missing, and that is where we try to build upon the perspective of behavioral finance. So as we'll see later, behavioral finance, unlike traditional finance, is more descriptive in its approach. It does not try to prescribe a solution on how to invest. Rather, it tries to explain the results of why anomalies occur, or why stocks behave differently from that prescribed by traditional finance. So we've seen the behavior of markets. We've seen that a lot of times markets behave irrationally as defined by traditional finance. So irrational from the perspective of traditional finance. What is the reason behind it is what we try to answer by some of the behavioral or psychological aspects of investing. Now, traditional finance hinges on 4 axioms. So what are the axioms? First is the axiom of completeness. That is, it is assumed that choices and preferences are known. to all investors, and everyone has complete information and complete access to all resources in the market. It assumes transitivity, that means rankings are applied consistently. So if I prefer A over B and I prefer B over C, then I will prefer A over C. That's the axiom of transitivity that you need to remember. The transitivity of independence says that utilities are additive and divisible. That is, if I prefer 100 rupees over 1000 rupees, then if we add a value Z to both 100 and 1000, it will not change my ranking. I will still prefer 100 rupees over 1000 rupees. So the axiom of independence says that adding a choice Z to both X and Y will not affect the preference of rankings. And finally, it assumes that indifference curves of investors are smooth and unbroken. If you recall, in level 2 and in level 1 when we studied portfolio management, indifference curves of investors looked something like this. So they were smooth and unbroken. We will study in more detail what is the meaning of an indifference curve, and we'll revise it from the perspective of investing. However, let's go back and revise a concept that we studied in level 1, that is the probability or the updated probability given new information. So traditional finance assumes, or even behavioral finance to some extent, that analysts have certain expectations about the occurrence of a particular event, which is the probability of A. However, when presented with new information, that is B, the probability of A given event B becomes updated, or is called the updated probability, and is given by the Bayes formula. So it's pretty easy to prove the Bayes formula as such. So Bayes formula says that probability of A given B. What is the probability of A given B? If you recall, probability of A intersection B upon probability of B. Probability of B given A in a similar manner will be written as probability of B intersection A over probability of A. Probability of B intersection A is the same as probability of A intersection B. So probability of A intersection B, I can take this towards this side, will be given by probability of B given A into the probability of A. Substitute A intersection B from the last calculated equation into the first equation, and we'll have probability of A given B as probability of B given A into probability of A upon probability of B. So that's the Bayes formula. Please memorize it again for level 3. Probability of A given B is given by probability of B given A into probability of A upon probability of B. One more concept of probability that we will have to recall before we can go ahead is the total probability rule. So total probability rule said that the probability of any event A in the universe can be given as probability of A given S1 into probability of S1 plus probability of A given S2 into probability of S2, so on and so forth, probability of A given Sn into probability of Sn, where what are S1, S2, S3, Sn? Are a set of mutually exclusive and exhaustive events. Okay, relatively easy to prove this formula as well. So let's assume this is the Venn diagram. These are my 4 mutually exclusive and exhaustive events. So mutually exclusive and exhaustive means that there is no intersection and that they together consummate the entire sample space. The probability of any event A, the probability of any event A can be given as probability of A given S1, which will be A intersection S1. This will be A intersection S1 upon the probability of S1 into the probability of S1. So S1 gets cancelled. This will be A intersection S1. This term will just remain A intersection S2, A intersection S3, so on and so forth. So it will be this plus the third term plus the fourth term. So please watch the videos on level 1 if you've forgotten the total probability rule. So probability of any event A can be given as probability of A given S1 into probability of S1 plus probability of A given S2 into probability of S2, so on and so forth, into probability of A given Sn into probability of Sn, where S1, S2, S3 are n mutually exclusive and exhaustive events. Now that we are empowered with these two equations, let's try to solve the question and apply the base formula. Assume a blue bag and a green bag. Each contain 10 coins. The blue bag contains 4 US coins and 6 Canadian coins. The green bag contains 8 US coins and 2 Canadian coins. Without looking at the bags, a young boy reaches into one of them and withdraws a US coin. Determine the probability that the boy reached into the blue bag. So let's define our events first. Let's define G as taking a green bag. B as selecting a blue bag, U as selecting a US coin, and C as selecting a Canadian coin. Now let's write down the information that is given to us. So what is the information that is given? The blue bag contains 4 US coins and 6 Canadian coins. So what is the probability of a U, that is a US coin, given that it is a blue bag? It will be 0.4. What is the probability of a Canadian coin given that it is a blue bag? It will be 0.6. Similarly, what is the probability of a US coin given a green bag? 0.8. What is the probability that it is a Canadian coin given that it is a green bag? It will be 0.2. Now this is the information that is given to us. What is the probability or the unconditional probability of a blue bag or of a green bag? It is 0.5. There are 2 bags, so probability of picking any one bag unconditionally is 0.5. Now the first and the most important thing to determine is what is the question asking. So a boy reaches into one of them and withdraws a US coin. Determine the probability that the boy reached into the blue bag. The question is that I have a US coin with me. So what is the probability that I chose a blue bag? So the question is, what is the probability of a blue bag given that I chose a US coin? So the question asks, what is the probability of B given U? Now how do we solve this? Probability of B given U can be written as probability of U given B. Notice it's not a slash, it's a perpendicular bar. Probability of U given B upon probability of U into the unconditional probability of a blue bag. This is the updated probability of a blue bag. The update is that I have a US coin. So the probability of U given B is given in the question. Let's say the probability of U given B is given, it's 0.4. The unconditional probability of a blue bag I know is 0.5, because unconditionally I could either have a blue bag or the green bag. There's a 50% chance of both. So the unconditional probability is 0.5 and the probability of a US coin given the blue bag is 0.4 multiplied by 0.5. Now the question asks, what is the probability of a US coin? What is the unconditional probability of picking a US coin? So no conditions attached. What is the probability of picking a US coin? The probability of any event U can be given as probability of U given B into probability of B plus probability of U given G into probability of G, where B and G are my mutually exclusive and exhaustive events. So B is the probability of picking a blue bag and G is the probability of just choosing a green bag. These events are mutually exclusive. You can either pick a blue bag or a green bag, and they are exhaustive because there are only two bags to begin with. There can either be a green bag or a blue bag. So these are mutually exclusive and exhaustive events. So probability of any event U can be defined as 0.4 into 0.5 plus probability of U given G, that is the probability of a US coin given a green bag, which is 0.8, into probability of a green bag, that is 0.5. So this will come out to be 0.2 plus 0.4 equals to 0.6. So let's apply it here. It will be 0.4 into 0.5 upon 0.6. So this comes out to be 0.33. So there's a 33% chance that you have picked a blue bag if you have a US coin. Is it logical? Earlier, the probability of the bag being a blue bag was 50%. The unconditional probability was 50%. If you picked a US coin, then it is more likely that you are in the green bag, because you see there is so much more US coins in the green bag. The green bag had 8 US coins, the blue bag only had 4. Hence the probability is higher now that you must be in the green bag and not in the blue bag. So that's how analysts update expectations about stocks also. Or that is how finance assumes that people update their expectations once they receive new information. So moving on to behavioral finance. Behavioral finance, as we discussed, is descriptive in nature. It does not try to prescribe a solution, rather it tries to explain what has happened, that why did people behave in a particular manner. Micro-behavioral finance tries to explain why individuals deviate from traditional finance. Macro-behavioral finance tries to tell us why the whole market as a whole can behave irrationally or can deviate from. Now let's revise the concept of indifference curves and utility. So understand the word utility. Utility means benefit. It has no units. For the purpose of our analysis, it has no units. Does drinking water have some utility for us? Yes, it gives us some satisfaction. Does achieving wealth, achieving success have utility? Yes, it does. Does garnering wealth, amassing wealth have utility? Yes, it does. Does it have different utility to different people? Gaining a lot of wealth gives some people a lot of satisfaction. Other people, it may not give as much satisfaction. So utility is basically the satisfaction that we arrive from a particular outcome or a particular occurrence. Just like we have utility, there can be disutility as well. Sickness gives us problems, it gives us disutility. So understand, this term is going to be used very often in the curriculum. So whenever the term utility comes, understand it's satisfaction, it has no units. So what is the satisfaction that you arrive or you achieve out of a particular outcome? Now let's revise the concept of indifference curves. Now none of us can decide the risk-free rate. This graph on the x-axis has risk and on the y-axis has expected return. So none of us can individually decide the risk in the, or rather the risk-free rate of return. That is when the risk-free rate or the risk is zero, what is the return that the market is offering. But all of us can decide our indifference. Let's understand what we mean. Let's say the risk-free rate is 5%. Then for taking some risk, would you demand at least a 6% return? You demand slightly higher return? That is in your hands. So if the risk-free rate is 5%, then at what expected return will you invest in a particular stock is your decision. Of course, you would want higher than the risk-free rate of return. So the risk-free rate is 5%, then for investing in equities or investing in a very simple or safe stock, you want 6%. Since it is equity, there is some higher risk. But tell me, if the risk-free rate or interest rates in the economy, like the way they are in the Indian economy right now, were 10%, would you still invest in the risky stock at 6%? Earlier you were willing to because risk-free rate was 5%. Now you would want a slightly higher return, you would maybe want 11% to invest in the risky stock. Similarly, for taking even more risk, you would want an even higher return. So as the risk increases, so does your expectation of return. In fact, it is a convex curve. That means risk has disutility. Taking on more risk, you want even higher return. If you see the nature of these curves, for assuming some risk, you are willing to accept just a marginally higher return. So for taking so much additional risk, you were satisfied with so much higher return, much lower. However, to take a similar amount of risk from a level higher than the current level of risk, you want a much higher return. That is, to a point, investor will be willing to accept risk. After that, he would expect, because he doesn't want to take so much more risk. He's satisfied with the wealth that he has or the wealth that he's expecting. If you want to force him or induce him to take even more risk, then you will have to offer a disproportionately higher return. So that's the risk aversion assumption that we studied, or that traditional finance assumes. Hence, utility curves are convex, or they move exponentially. Now, all of us understand that these curves or these utility curves are for the same investor. That is, given a particular level of returns, he can decide his indifference. So if the risk-free rate is 5, then for taking some risk, I would want a higher return. But if the risk-free rate is higher, then for taking a amount of risk, I would require an even higher return. I would not settle for the amount I settled earlier. So understand that these indifference curves are all for the same investor. However, an investor would prefer to be on the highest curve. The utility or satisfaction provided by curve 3 as a whole is higher than curve 2 is higher than curve 1. Along curve 3, he is indifferent. or the satisfaction that he is getting or the utility is the same. Why? Because he feels that the additional risk is made up for by the additional return. So he is indifferent between the choices. Now, given an efficient frontier represents the best set of portfolios for a given level of risk. So for a particular level of risk, let's say the level of risk shown here, the best return is offered by this portfolio. There is no portfolio that can give you a higher return than this portfolio for a given level of risk. Now, all else equal, the investor would want to be in the highest return portfolio. Rather, he would want to maximize his utility. That is, maximize his satisfaction. We understood that curves which are higher than the other, all indifference curves are for the same investor, they are parallel to each other. The curve which is higher gives him more absolute return, gives him more satisfaction. So all else equal, or as far as possible, the investor would want to be in the highest utility curve, or the curve that brings him the highest satisfaction. So he would not want to be in curve I1. He could be on curve I1 by investing in portfolio A or investing in portfolio C, which are available. But will he choose it? No, he will try to go higher. He will try to go higher in the utility curve until he reaches portfolio D, at which one of his indifference curves is exactly tangent to the efficient frontier. The problem at this level is that even if he wants, ideally he would want to be on this indifference curve as high as possible. But is there a portfolio available? There isn't. The highest amount of utility that this investor can achieve given the current state of the economy or the current level of expected returns is at portfolio D, because this is the highest or the steepest indifference curve that the investor can choose. Hence, the investor will choose portfolio D. This is what we studied in traditional finance as well. He would love to, the investor would love to have portfolio E, but is there a portfolio E available? The current gamut of universe only lets me choose securities along the efficient frontier. If a portfolio F was available, he would have definitely much rather chosen F, because I4 has a higher utility than I3, I2 and I1 as well. So that's what he studied in level 1, that you choose the portfolio which is tangent to the efficient frontier because it maximizes your utility or it maximizes your satisfaction. So that's the utility theory. We will use this again. That is, investor tries to maximize his level of satisfaction. Now, we'll study 3 types of investors. First is the risk-averse investors. So, for the risk-averse investor, the utility of wealth increases, but it increases at a decreasing rate. If the investor is risk-averse, utility of wealth increases at a decreasing rate. So, at point A, the investor has so much wealth. At point B, the investor has higher wealth. Where will you be more satisfied? The x-axis is the level of wealth. A means a lower level of wealth and B means a higher level of wealth. Where is an investor more likely to be more satisfied? Obviously, at the higher level of wealth. However, the question isn't whether he will be more satisfied or not. The question is how much more satisfied will he be? So definitely he will be more satisfied. But if he is a risk-averse investor, he will not be significantly more satisfied. So he he is happy with what he has right now. He doesn't like taking risk. He is not, or he doesn't hope to achieve great things or great amount of money. He doesn't think he needs it. So for a risk-averse investor, that is the topmost curve, as the wealth increases, satisfaction or utility means satisfaction, guys. Utility will go up, but it will go up at a decreasing rate. That is, more amount of wealth will not give as much more satisfaction. So let's see, for taking this wealth up from a level of his wealth up from a level of first few units. Let's say wealth goes up from here to here, and in the second case the wealth again goes up by a similar amount but at a higher level. So the amount of wealth increases constant. This distance is constant between the two bars. Where does he get more satisfaction? In the first case, the increase in satisfaction is a lot higher. For the same amount of increase in wealth. Whereas in the second case, for the same amount of increase in wealth, his increase in satisfaction, he's definitely more satisfied, more wealth means, but it's not as high. So for risk-averse investors, the utility function is concave. That is, the utility wealth increases at a decreasing rate. For a risk-neutral investor, more wealth means more happiness. It improves or it increases linearly. If he has 10 units more wealth, he will have 10 units more satisfaction. For a risk-seeking investor, the utility of wealth increases at an increasing rate. For the first few units of money, if he got a satisfaction increase of 10 units, then if later on the wealth increases by the same amount, he becomes even happier, or he becomes much more happy. So this is a personality trait. There's no right or wrong here. Different investors or different people have different personalities. Risk-seeking investors have the utility of wealth increasing at an increasing rate. So that's about the utility function, guys. So now we move on to the behavioral aspects of stock picking. So traditional finance also said that investors try to maximize utility. Behavioral finance also says that investors do try to maximize utility. But how they do that is slightly different from one another. So behavioral finance says that in the evaluation of their utility or in the evaluation of their satisfaction, investors follow a slightly different path. So rather than analyze risk and expected return, investors analyze possible gains and losses. So investors are not supercomputers. They don't have Excel sheets. They don't have correlations and returns of all. So they will do their analysis in a slightly more simplistic manner. So what behavioral finance says is that when you and me go and invest in the market, this is what we do. So for every stock, we associate something like what is the probability that I'll have a profit here, what is the probability that I'll have a loss here, and that's how I start thinking, or that's how I go about it. So investors are more concerned with the change in wealth rather than the absolute level of wealth. So at whatever level of wealth we are, we don't want to lose it. Now we are worried about whether we will lose our money or whether we will gain money from our current level. So we are more worried about the change in wealth rather than the absolute level. He says greater value is placed on a loss than on a gain of an equal amount, and this often leads to risk-seeking behavior. So if the investor goes into a casino and he loses 50 rupees, he places a lot more weight on this. That means he would rather lose 100, but he'll work very hard to break even or get this 50 rupees back. A gain of 50 rupees is not looked at the same value. So if I've just gained 50 rupees, I've gained nothing. I want to play more, I want to gain more. So this 50 rupees is not as valuable. But a loss of 50 rupees is very bad. I have to recover it. I have to at least have break even. So greater value is placed on a loss than on a gain of equal amount is what behavioral theory says. Now that's how investors behave. That's how people behave in life. Now the way we pick stocks or way we decide how to construct a portfolio follows two paths. First, there is a process of editing. That is, whatever information we get, we edit it in a particular way, and then we have a process of evaluation. So the process follows editing and evaluation. Let's understand the first step of how we invest. That is, how do we edit the data, the entire gamut of information that is presented to us. First is a step of codification. So codification says that first of all, I will have something in my mind as gain or loss. It may not necessarily be zero. So I will say that, okay, if I've made 10 rupees out of this investment, that means I have a gain. If I have not made 10 rupees in an investment, that means I have a loss. So it can be zero also. So if I've made more, or if I have a return greater than zero, that means I've made profit. If I've actually had a loss, that means I've had a loss. So he will have some definition in his mind of what is a gain and what is a loss. He just says that it may not necessarily be zero. Even if you have 10 rupees, you may think that you haven't gained anything. Or sometimes even if you have 20 rupees, you may think that you have gained nothing. So the investor will first have a definition of gain or loss. For the sake of simplicity, we'll just assume that to be zero. So greater than zero means I have a gain, less than zero means I have a loss. So the first process in editing the information is codification. Different alternatives I will segregate as, or different outcomes I will segregate as gain or loss. Then for every particular stock, I will do a process of combination. That is, I will link the outcome, the gain or loss or a particular level of return, with a probability of occurrence. So in a particular stock, there is a 50% chance that I will gain 50 rupees. There is a 50% chance that I will gain 100 rupees. Some analysis like that I will have in my mind. So the process of codification will be a 10% chance of having a negative return, a 20% chance of having a no return, 70% chance of having a 10 rupees return. Something like that is the second thing that all investors do in their minds. Third, we follow a process of segregation. That means we separate these certain and uncertain components of a bet. So if the outcome of combination came out to be as presented in the example, so there's a 50% chance of a $50 profit and a 50% chance of a $100 profit, then so this is the outcome of the combination. How do we segregate? How will we segregate the outcomes? How will we segregate the certain and uncertain components of this gamble? Can I write that this basically means there is there any probability of loss? There is a 100% chance of getting 50 rupees. So there is a 100% chance of getting 50 rupees, and then there is a 50% chance that I may get 0, or there is a 50% chance that I get 50. So when I segregate the outcome of 50% chance of getting a 50 and 50% chance of getting 100, what can I say? There is a 100% chance of getting 50 rupees, because in either case I'm at least getting 50. After that, there is a 50% chance of getting a 0 and a 50% chance of getting a 50. So the third step that we do in editing is we separate the certain and uncertain parts of a gamble. So that's how, or that's the mental picture they will create for each of the stocks. So for each stock or each information provided to them, they will edit it like this. That is the first 3 steps of editing. First, they will define something as loss or gain in their mind. Then the outcome will be combined with the probability. Then we will segregate the certain and uncertain components of the gamble. So we'll say that the certain component is 100% I will get 50 rupees no matter what happens in this outcome. 50% chance thereafter, over and above this 50, I may get nothing, and a 50% chance that over and above this 50, I may get additional 50 rupees. So this is how I will do it for stock A. Similar analysis I will do in my mind for stock B. So there will be stock A, there will be stock B, there will be stock C. For all stocks I will do this. Okay. Then he says eventually I can buy only 1 or 2 stocks. I have to decide which stock to pick and which stock not to pick. Ideally I want to pick the stock which has the highest utility for me, which gives me the highest satisfaction. For some investors, high return may be high satisfaction. For some investors, low return but high safety may give higher satisfaction. So that will come later, guys. That will come in the evaluation phase. Right now we are still editing the information that is there. So I have information about different stocks. So let's say A and B. There are 2 stocks. So stock A, there's a 20% chance will give me -5, 30% chance that gives me 4, 30% chance that gives me 8, 20% chance that it gives me 10. Similarly for stock B, I will associate the outcomes with probability, that is I will perform combination and thereafter segregation. He says I will eliminate the identical choices. So both these stocks have a 30% chance of giving me 8. So this makes no difference in my comparison, so I don't want to waste too much of my brain on this. So I will cancel identical outcomes and I will evaluate on the rest whether stock A makes more sense to me or stock B makes more sense to me. That process is still not come. How do I evaluate whether which stock makes more sense to me comes next. So first I will cancel the identical outcomes and then I will try to look for domination. Okay. He says precise numbers will be approximated. So if there's a 48-52, so 48% chance of getting a 52 rupees return, he says I'll broadly think of it like 50-50. So all this I do in my brain when I'm editing the information that is present. The final step in editing the information will be a detection of dominance. So I will eliminate choices like A. Let's see, there are 2 stocks A and B. In stock A, 60% of the times I get $2 and 40% of the times I get $5. This may not exactly be true, guys. This is what I think. So I think that in stock A, 60% of the times I get $2, 40% of the times I get $5. Whereas in stock B, 75% of the times I get $6 and 25% of the times I get $12. So which stock will I go with? A or B? Both have risk, both have certain probabilities, but you see that stock B dominates stock A. In the worst of cases also, it provides a return better than the best of A. The worst of B is better than the best of A. The worst of B is better than the best of A. So I will eliminate choices like A and I will only think about stocks like B. So that's where I complete the process of editing the information. So now I will have a lot of stocks in my mind like B, which are dominant. So some is giving 8 and 18 or 0 and 18, and then I have to choose which stocks to buy, which stocks not to buy. So this is the process of editing the information that we have received. It's tough. You have to memorize steps. Please watch the video again as many times as you need to until you remember and understand these steps as well. Okay, it is very easy to forget them. Level 3 is a lot about memorization. It's a lot about remembering stuff because these areas are grey. Many times you will not agree with what the theory says. You may be right. There is no guarantee that the book is right. If the book was right, if the author was right, the author wouldn't be writing books. He would be a millionaire investing in stocks. Okay, so understand, you have to remember these steps. These are the steps that behavioral prescribes, or behavioral finance prescribes investors follow in the way of investing. So first they edit the information. Some of the mistakes that may happen in the process of editing, or when they are editing, some biases that may creep in are like the isolation effect. Okay, it happens at the time when the investor is doing the cancellation process normally. So the mistake or the bias that investors may do is that, assume there are two stock options or two lottery options, 1 and 2. So lottery 1 has a 5% chance of paying you $1,000 and a 95% chance of paying 0. Lottery 2 has a 50% chance of giving 100 and a 50% chance of giving 0. Which lottery dominates the other? The question is, which lottery dominates the other? The answer is neither. So there is no domination happening in this example. That there is a 50, even lottery 1, the expected payoff is $50. Even from lottery 2, the expected payoff is $50. So 50% of the times you will give $100, and here 95% of the times you will get 0. When investors do the analysis in their mind, what numbers strike them is 1,000 and 0. So how they think about the two investors, or this is a mistake that they do, how they think about it is, okay, both of them are giving me 0 in the worst case. In the best case, this gives me 1,000 and this gives me 100. They forget that the probabilities are so skewed, or they are skewed enough that both are actually equivalent in terms of expected return. However, investor will think, worst case I get 0, in the best case lottery 1 can give me 1,000. So the probability of large gain is slightly overstated or over understood, and the probability of loss is understated. Then investors look at different alternatives in the manner we described. So when they look at investors, or when they look at alternatives in how we described, they will often take lottery 1 as dominating, or they will always, not necessarily dominating, but They will cancel off this 0 and 0. They will cancel off this 0. Well, they should not have, because the probability is much different. They are not ideally cancelable. Identical choices can be cancelled. So if 0 and 50 was there, it could have been cancelled. These two should not be cancelled. So investors subconsciously cancel it, saying that worst case is 0, best case lottery 1 gives me better, and that's how they make a mistake. So all of us, if you ask a retail investor his portfolio, normally it will have stocks like Jayaprakash, DLF, or rather very risky stocks. Why? Because they see the huge gain and they forget the big loss that is also possible in these stocks. Now we come to the evaluation phase. So once he's edited the information with mistakes or without mistakes, how does he decide which stock to invest in or which stock to choose? So the second phase is that of evaluation. So how does he evaluate? He multiplies the probability of each outcome with its utility. So the probability of each outcome is multiplied by the satisfaction or dissatisfaction derived from that outcome. So a loss will essentially give me dissatisfaction or negative utility. A profit will give me satisfaction. So now understand, let's say the outcomes are 50% of 50 and 50% chance of -10. So these are the alternatives that this is one of the investments, and a 50% chance of -50. This is the investment that I'm evaluating. 50% will not be multiplied by 50. It will be multiplied by the utility of having 50 rupees, which may be very different. Again, -50 will not be multiplied, or 50% will again not be multiplied by -50. It will be multiplied by the utility of having -50, or the utility or disutility. It can be a negative number of having a loss of 50. And then the investor will try to maximize his total satisfaction, that is the total utility. Okay, again he just wants to clarify that the probabilities are not the actual probabilities of a particular outcome. The probabilities are as perceived by the investor. Similarly, the utility is not the actual utility of the wealth. The utility is as perceived by the investor. So we will do an example and understand this better. Based on the following data, determine and explain using utility theory whether or not the investor is likely to make the investment. So there is an outcome, or there is an investment. The outcome can be -8%, the probability of which is 15%. The utility of this outcome is actually -120. There is a disutility because he's having a loss. 0% outcome, that is no gain, no loss, does not have zero utility. That also has negative utility to this investor. Okay, so even if I make nothing, I'm quite dissatisfied. The probability of which is 40%. The outcome 6% has a utility of 50, a probability of 30, and the outcome of 10% has a utility of 100 and a probability of 15%. So guys, these are, let's say, unbiased probabilities or the actual probabilities. However, the investor feels differently. The investor feels that -8 is more likely, so he will multiply this probability by 1.25. The investor feels that 0% is also more likely and the profits are less likely. So he multiplies the unbiased probabilities or the actual probabilities by his subjectivity when he does the analysis. Now let's try to see whether this investor will gain any satisfaction out of investing in the stock. So let's see the total amount of satisfaction. The probability of having a -8% return is 15%. multiplied with the subjective probability of the investor, so multiplied by 1.25. And what is the utility that he's gaining? Return may be -8, that doesn't matter. The question is, what is the satisfaction that I gain? It is -120. There is a 40 into 1.15% chance that I will get a satisfaction or a dissatisfaction of -10. There is a 30 into 0.85% chance that I will get a satisfaction of 50 units, and there is a 15 into 0.65% chance that I will get a satisfaction of 100. So what is my total expected satisfaction or dissatisfaction? Sum it all up, sum all the terms up that are there on the slide. So the sum or the total satisfaction or the expected satisfaction, expected utility comes out to be -4.6. He'll likely be dissatisfied. Do you think even if he didn't have any other alternative, will he undertake this investment alternative? Will he undertake this investment option? So he's getting a dissatisfaction, so he will not undertake. So that's what the evaluation phase tries to tell us. Now guys, why do people invest like this? Because investors are not rational economic investors as traditional finance assumes. We work with bounded rationality. Why is it bounded rationality? It's not that we don't want to be rational. Of course, given the cognitive power, that is given the mental power and given the information, all of us would like to be, or all of us would like to process huge amount of information. But we have other work to do also, and we have only 24 hours in a day. So all of us end up working in a state of bounded rationality. So bounded rationality essentially says that we sometimes take steps that are not in our best interest. Not because we want to, but because we end up doing so due to the lack of complete information or due to the lack of adequate processing power. So rather than choosing the optimal portfolio as given by traditional finance risk return analysis, we take a portfolio that satisfies us or that best suits our profile or that we think is the best option given the alternative. So we satisfy ourselves rather than find the optimal solution. So wherever we are satisfied, we go and take the investment. Why? Because there is lack of complete information and there is lack of adequate processing power with individual investors. So guys, how do portfolios get constructed? So that's how, or in the previous section we learned how we pick stocks or how investors decide whether to take this stock or the other. Now we learned that how do investors construct portfolios. The traditional finance says that a large number of profit maximizing investors are continuously valuing and analyzing securities, so the markets are efficient. That is, the price is right. Asset prices reflect all available information and adjust fully and accurately to reflect the new information. It says that active investment or active fund management cannot add value or cannot outperform. That is the no free lunches theorem, which is that new information comes to the market in a random manner and nobody has privileged access to that information. Hence, making return forecast and consistently outperforming is impossible. You may outperform once or twice, but then you will lose money also once or twice. Sustainably predicting market returns is impossible in an efficient market. Let's just revise the three forms of market efficiencies. The weak form said that analyzing price and volume data is useless. That is, technical analysis is useless. Semi-strong form says that analyzing public information is useless. That is, analyzing company balance sheets, company results, information is also useless because everyone has the same information. Everybody has already priced that in. You cannot outperform by doing fundamental analysis also. That is the semi-strong form of efficiency. The strong form of market efficiency says that even if you have insider information, even if you know the management, even if you are the promoter, you cannot make money. Normally, evidence is pretty high towards the weak and semi-strong form. Strong form has inconclusive, or strong form, we say that normally promoters and exchange specialists have seen to make excess returns. However, security analysts and fund managers, if you consider them as insiders since they meet the company managements more often or more frequently, have not made any excess returns. So broadly, markets are believed to be efficient. However, there are certain anomalies that have been consistently found. So what are the anomalies to the efficient market hypothesis? First is that it has been seen that small cap firms outperform large cap firms. So basically in the long run, you can make profit by investing more in small cap firms and less in large cap firms. That has been observed. So here are some fundamental analyses. It has also been seen that actually your curriculum is slightly misleading in this aspect. Across levels we've learned that value firms outperform growth firms. Okay, so please read it the other way around. It has been seen in the market that firms which have low valuations and high dividend yields, which are value firms, have seen to have outperformed growth firms. If the market was efficient and every stock was efficiently priced, then there would not be an anomaly like this. We have also observed certain technical anomalies. That is, investing based on moving averages. That is, whenever the moving averages curves intersect each other, or buying at support levels and selling at resistance levels, have seen to make money. So we have noticed that certain technical anomalies also exist. And there are certain calendar anomalies also that are seen in the market. One of them is called the January effect. The January effect is that if you invest in the beginning of January and you sell after a couple of weeks, you will normally make money. So did you guys notice that this January? If you bought right at the beginning of January and sold after 2 or 3 weeks, you would normally make money. So the market is higher in the middle or end of January than it is at the beginning of January. That's the January effect. It has been noticed across markets. The turn of the month effect is that investors earn highest returns during the first 5 days of a month. So there are certain anomalies that do seem to exist that challenge the efficient market hypothesis. Now, traditional finance tries to say that okay, there is higher risk and hence these firms give a higher return, or it tries to give a risk return type of analysis to explain these anomalies. Okay. However, behavioral finance says that these anomalies are not actually anomalies. They are mispricings. They are mispricings that happen due to psychological factors. And those psychological factors, behavioral finance tries to explain. So he says that these anomalies are actually mispricings that if you correctly identify, you can trade off and make money, or you can make excess return, outperform the market if you catch these mispricings. These mispricings happen due to various psychological reasons, as we'll study in the remaining part of the review. So a few models or a few reasons why he says these anomalies occur is, number one, the consumption and savings model. He says people normally lack self-control. So he says that everyone has certain budgeting in mind of his own money. That is, he wants to invest some money, some part of his income, and he wants to spend the remaining part of his income. So all of us do that analysis. However, most of us end up spending more than what we budgeted. So we do not necessarily achieve the optimal balance of short-term consumption and long-term investing. So sometimes we consume more in the short term than we should, considering our long-term liabilities and our long-term requirements, and sometimes we consume too less as against our long-term requirements. Why do we do that? It can happen due to various reasons. One of the reasons is framing. Framing says that the same information, the exactly same information, can be processed differently. Depending on what? Depending on the way it is presented, or depending on my state of mind at that point of time. Now guys, understand this. The same chocolate, the same box of chocolates looks like a much bigger gift or a much better gift if it is wrapped properly. It is in a big box, even though the chocolate is one only. But it is in a big box with a lot of this around, which costs nothing, but a big cardboard box around it. So you'll be like, oh, this guy gave me a big gift. He's my good friend. Whereas your other friend also gave you a chocolate, but he just came and gave you the chocolate from his hand. So it's the same chocolate that he's given you, but the way the information is packaged or the way the data is packaged may make you understand it differently, or may make you give it higher or lower credibility, higher or lower value than you would have. Similarly, depending on the investor's state of mind, the information can be processed differently. If I'm just going to college and my friend comes and gives me a chocolate, I'll be happy about it. Why? Because I'm in a normal mood, and the chocolate I have a lot of value to the chocolate. Now let's say there has been some tragedy in my family and I'm very depressed, and then I go and then my friend gives me a chocolate because he's passed exam or he's very happy about something. So will I have the same reaction towards the chocolate? Will I be that happy? Will I still eat it? Will I enjoy it? I'll probably throw it away because I'm not in the mood. So he's saying that the same information can be processed differently by investors depending on the way it is packaged or my state of mind. This anomaly or this bias sometimes is called framing. Okay, the way the question is asked or the way the information is invested can result in different reactions. So somebody comes, oh, this stock looks like a great buy. This company has, or there's a probability that this company may have some gold or may have some extra land. So everybody is shouting about it. Then we may think that, oh, it's a good investment. So even though we were not supposed to invest, we end up investing more. Or sometimes we said, oh, stock right now, the mood is very bad. So stock markets are very bad. Investing in stocks is going to cause you a loss. So because the frame or the state of mind is so negative that we don't end up investing in stocks, even though we know that in a long-term asset allocation, having stocks is a good thing. It performs better. So because of framing, because of self-control bias, self-control is that we end up spending more. There is more emphasis on current consumption than on future goals. Who has seen the future? Things will take care of themselves in the future. Let me have a nice life right now. Finally, we do mental accounting. We segregate our portfolio depending on various needs. There is a need to fund my child's education. There is a need to buy a house. There is a need to get my daughter married. There is a need to go on a vacation. And there is a need for having a decent lifestyle right now. So we will have 5 different goals, and we will construct 5 different portfolios corresponding to the 5 different goals. We will fail to understand the correlations between the assets in different portfolios. At the end of the day, all of it is our own money. All of it is one portfolio according to me. But because we segregate our portfolios into 5 different portfolios, we often ignore the correlation between assets and we invest suboptimally. So he says mispricings happen because people invest suboptimally because of the reasons of framing, self-control bias and mental accounting. He says that the way we classify wealth also determines whether it is likely to be retained or it is likely to be spent. So if the wealth is classified as current income, then it is most likely to be spent. And the same piece of wealth, different investors can classify it differently. So let's say my friend owed me 100 rupees. Okay, long back, I have even forgotten about it. My friend owed me 100 rupees and now he comes and gives it to me. So one fine day my friend comes, he remembers and he gives me 100 rupees. Now it depends on how I look at it. If I look at this 100 rupees as current income, that is okay, oh great, so my income has gone up by 100 rupees. I will most likely spend the 100 rupees. If I see the 100 rupees as current assets, that is, I don't see it as income, my income is my salary only, this 100 is also my saving that should have been saved. That is, I see it as an asset, I see it as a house, or I see it as a savings in a bank account which is already there. Then I'm less likely to spend it. So income is more likely to be spent, guys. Normally people don't like drawing down on their savings. And thirdly, if the income is classified as future income, that is, my friend is likely to give me 100 rupees. So will I spend 100 rupees now in anticipation that I will get that 100 rupees in the future? I may, but it is least likely that I will do that. So if I classify my wealth, if I think of my wealth as future income, I am least likely to spend it. If I think of it as current assets, I am more likely to spend it, but still lesser. If I think of the wealth as current income, then I am most likely to spend it. It is the second model that tries to explain anomalies is the behavioral asset pricing model. He says that CAPM is wrong. He says CAPM assumes too many things. It assumes unbiased expectations. It assumes risk and return is known. It says that market prices are determined through an unbiased analysis of risk and return. So the behavioral model says that if you invest like this, you will misprice. You must add a sentiment premium. In the calculation of expected return from a stock, each stock must have a sentiment premium. He says how is the sentiment premium determined? The greater the dispersion of analysts' forecasts. So for the same stock, if there is a stock A and 10 analysts have a wide range of forecasts for the earnings, that means that is a risky stock or there is something wrong. Then why aren't people able to estimate it? If the divergence in estimates is so high, that means I will have a high sentiment premium. Whereas for a stock wherein there are 10 analysts and all analysts have their estimates near about the same number, I'll say fine, this is a cleaner company, it's a better management, it shares more information, so most of the people have similar estimates, so I will assign a lower sentiment premium. So behavioral asset pricing model says that you must assign a sentiment premium as well. The behavioral portfolio theory differs in the modern portfolio theory in saying that rather than holding it's similar to the mental accounting concept that we just studied, that rather than holding well diversified portfolios, individuals hold a combination of riskless assets, that is completely riskless, no risk at all, and considerably riskier assets because they don't look at their portfolio in a holistic way. They segregate their objectives into different goals, and corresponding to the goals, they segregate their portfolios as well. So there will be 5 goals that I have, so I have 5 different portfolios. 4 of the goals are critical, so my entire portfolio is invested in fixed income securities. Daughter's marriage, child's education, constructing a house, all are very important, so it is 80% of the portfolio becomes fixed income. And then I want to go for a vacation also, going for a vacation is not that important, so I invest in the riskiest assets, because even if I lose that money, all that will happen is I won't go for a vacation, so nothing big. So I will have very risky assets and I will have very secure assets, which may or may not be the optimal allocation as determined by the modern portfolio theory. So he says, because people don't invest in modern portfolio theory, that is why the results in the market or the behavior of the market differs from what is prescribed by traditional finance. So people invest in segregated portfolios, hence certain securities can be mispriced. So what are the factors that go into the construction of the portfolio, or what type of securities go into the portfolio? First of all, it is the importance of goals. If the goal is very important, then I will fund it by holding cash or holding fixed income securities. If the required return is high, after funding all my goals, to go for a vacation, I need at least a 50% return. Otherwise, I won't be able to fund it. So, higher the required return, higher will be the risk. The investor's utility function, let's recall, utility function had utility on the y-axis and wealth on the x-axis. If the utility function is concave, please go back and watch the video if you have forgotten the same video. Concave utility function implies a risk-averse investor. So, if the utility function is more concave, that means the investor would be willing to make more diversified portfolios. Why so? He is willing to give up on the wealth of one stock. So even if he thinks that one stock is a good investment, it's not like he will put his entire wealth in it because he wants to get the high return out of it. High return or high wealth is not as satisfactory to him. So he will be willing to diversify or give up the gains of a good stock. Even though he has one good stock, when an advisor tries to tell him that we know that the stock is good, but it makes sense to diversify because you can always make a mistake, he will understand better and he will take the other next best stock also. Whereas someone to whom wealth matters a lot will not give out his money from the good stock and give it to the next best stock because he wants maximum return. So he will say, no, wealth is very important to me, I want to be in the good stock so that my wealth is maximized. So if you're a risk-averse investor, that is, the utility function is more concave, then the portfolio will likely be more diversified. Whereas if you're a risk-seeking investor, then you are likely to hold more concentrated portfolios. Depending on the access to information, if you think that you have some information advantage, that you have some insider information, then you will likely invest a lot of money in that stock. If you think that you don't have any informational advantage, then you will construct a more diversified portfolio since you don't know anything more about any one particular security. And finally, the degree of loss aversion impacts the way the portfolio is constructed. So he says that people don't like recognizing a loss. Once in a loss, they end up taking riskier positions. Why? Because whether I have 50 rupees of loss or 100 rupees of loss, I will still have to call myself a loss. So as soon as I have 50 rupees of loss, it is seen that I start doubling my bets such that I can get out of the loss and at least be in the green, be in some profit. So because of loss aversion, people become more risk seeking when in a loss. Or they hold too much cash. They just don't invest in equities at all to avoid the possibility of having a loss or recognizing a loss. So it may result in either holding too much cash or taking riskier bets once in a loss. And how do investors construct their portfolios? So for the critical goals, they will allocate it to very low risk securities. So daughter's wedding, child's education, they will have a safety net sort of a portfolio that no matter what happens, not a lot of volatility, this will be met. Over and above that, whatever is the wealth will be allocated to riskier securities, because then the goals are not considered as important as the critical goals. Here's the final theory that explains why markets have anomalies or they deviate from traditional expectations, is the adaptive markets hypothesis. It says that there is no one formula to success. There is no one theory that can explain how markets should behave or how you should invest. It says that successful market participants adapt. First of all, they apply heuristics. Heuristic means, or heuristics are rules of thumb. What is the meaning of heuristics? If a company pays dividends, it is a good company. If a company has low PE multiple, it is a good stock. If the company is in the infrastructure sector, it is a good investment. So first of all, successful market participants don't have great models or don't necessarily have great correlation models that they can use to apply. They have certain rules of thumbs, which are called heuristics. That if then analysis they do that. If this happens, then this. So if the stock has gone up for 10 days, then it will probably go down. So some heuristics they will apply. The problem is that no heuristic works forever. So in a particular market, a particular heuristic will work. So in 2007, sell any equity stock is a heuristic that would have worked. If it is an equity stock, it should be sold. In 2000, buying a technology stock is a heuristic that would have worked. So different times in the market, different heuristics work. Successful investors adapt and develop or learn new heuristics for themselves. So those investors who cannot adapt do not survive or lose out on their money or lose all their money. So he says that investors apply heuristics. Why? Because they work in bounded rationality. They don't have the processing power or the entire set of information. So they satisfice. They satisfice means they create these rules of thumb. What they think serves their purpose or serves to indicate a good investment, rather than do a complete analysis and maximize the utility according to an optimal portfolio. So some conclusions of the AMH will help remembering. Investors make decisions to help themselves survive rather than to maximize the utility. Investors must adapt to survive. Because participants adapt, no strategy can continually outperform. You have to always follow that strategy that will work in this market. Risk premiums vary depending on the investor's perceptions and the risk aversion. Because investors satisfice rather than do a complete analysis, assets can be temporarily mispriced. Active management can capture these excess returns. So he says, yes, markets are inefficient, those anomalies are mispricings, and successful investors can capture them. Let's do 2 questions and we'll take a break. An investor has ranked 3 investments labeled as A, B and C. He prefers investment A to investment B and B to investment C. Not being able to rank A relative to investment C would most likely violate which of the 4 axioms of utility? So which axiom is violated? It is transitivity. Applying independence or applying the independence axiom of utility, an investor who prefers investment A to investment B and has the option to add all or a portion of investment C to his selection would not prefer, he prefers A to B. So if you add a similar amount of C, will not make a difference. So relatively easy questions. Do not expect them to be tested. This is a good question, guys. Please do the first question on the screen. Let's see who gets it right. A rational There are two investments. Data for two investments are presented below. Investment A has an expected return of 8% and a standard deviation of 20%. Investment B has an expected return of 10% and a standard deviation of 20%. A rational investor who selects investment B over investment A. So an investor is selecting investment B over investment A. Is he risk seeking, risk averse, or risk neutral? Remember, utility functions determine or define whether the investor is risk seeking, risk averse, or risk neutral. Concave was the graph for risk averse investors. Convex was the graph for risk seeking investors. Linear was the graph for risk neutral. Go back in the video and please watch that slide again if you've forgotten. Now tell me, would a risk neutral investor choose investment A or B? Would a risk neutral investor choose investment A or B? You would choose investment A. B. Would a risk seeking investor choose investment A or B? A risk seeking investor will also choose investment B. And even if you are risk averse, you will choose investment B. Actually, this data is redundant. This data gives me no information. It gives me zero information. The risk is the same and the return is higher. Regardless of what category of investor you are, you will take investment option B. Then where is the hint? So how do I solve this question? Guys, understand. Rational investor. A rational investor is assumed to be risk averse. This information is redundant because the question mentions a rational investor. Traditional finance assumes that investors are risk averse. This is a good question. It's a trick question. These are the kind of questions that will come in the exam, guys. Okay? There will be a lot of redundant information. There will be a lot of extra information that gives you nothing. Only if you're clear with the concepts and you've read and remembered the curriculum enough will you be able to solve them. An investor who seeks risk in investing most likely experiences increasing marginal utility of risk. Okay? So if you're seeking risk, that means your marginal utility of risk is increasing. According to prospect theory, investors are more concerned with changes in wealth than in returns per se. Prospect theory suggests that investors are risk averse, can be loss averse, place more value on gains than on losses of equal magnitude. This is wrong, it's the other way around. They place more value on loss than on a gain of an equal amount. They can be loss averse, yes, that's what we studied. That investors can be loss averse. Now, a market is simply where a buyer and a seller meet. So a buyer is also a human being and a seller is also a human being. So they are all susceptible to different states of mind, of different psychological circumstances, and they are susceptible to different biases. Because of these biases, they may trade at different prices or different levels. So in this review, we'll try to study what are the different psychological factors and psychological biases that individuals have. So what are the behavioral biases that people have? Okay, they may or may not be financial or may not be stock market related. So these are general biases that we have, and then we will study how they manifest themselves in the stock market or in portfolio construction. So biases happen because of two reasons, okay? Or there are two types of behavioral biases. First are cognitive biases. So cognitive biases happen due to the inability to analyze all information from basing decisions on incomplete information. So why? Because the information available to us is limited, and because our processing power is limited, hence we are susceptible to certain cognitive biases. Cognitive biases are broken into two parts, that is belief perseverance and processing errors. So we'll understand. So belief perseverance is normally because there are certain tendencies that we can't let go of, and processing errors are normally because of our inability to account for the entire information or an inability to understand the entire complexity of investing as a whole. Emotional biases are relatively difficult to correct, guys. Emotional biases come because of certain psychological predispositions. This has got a lot to do with the way we've been brought up, different instances that must have happened in our life, different experiences that we've had with different people, with different situations, with different things. So I tried to steal something and I got caught the first time only. Another guy has been stealing all his life, never got caught. So he's a more risk-seeking guy. The first guy is very risk-averse because he's very scared of taking risk, because his experience with risk-taking activities has been very bad. So emotional biases happen because of psychological dispositions. So let's understand the different categories of cognitive errors first, and you have to memorize these. There's no running away, okay? So, and there will be a lot of overlap. A lot of time you will be unable to tell one bias from the other, or the same behavior can be elicited because of a number of biases. So the first category of cognitive biases is due to belief perseverance. So belief perseverance related cognitive errors or biases happen because of our attempt to avoid cognitive dissonance. Now understand this very well. Cognitive dissonance is the difference between our beliefs and actions. So cognitive dissonance is the difference. We believe something else, but we are doing something else. People want to minimize that. People want to think that they are doing what they feel or what they believe. So when asked, are you a good fund manager? Everyone will say, yes, I'm a better fund manager. But when you see the performance of their portfolios, he's been amongst the worst performing fund managers over a 1-year period, 10-year period, 5-year period, no matter how you cut it. But still, when you ask him, is he a good fund manager? Yes, he thinks he's a better fund manager than the others. So that's cognitive dissonance. It's a difference between belief and actions. People want to minimize this. You don't want cognitive dissonance. So you do actions that you feel are correct according to your understanding or according to your own theories. So that's what you try to do. So we try to avoid cognitive dissonance. Because we try to avoid cognitive dissonance, these are the biases that come in. So the first bias is called conservatism. Conservatism essentially says more emphasis on information used to form the first forecast. The first time I forecasted the set of factors that I had, I used them. Now even though new information is coming, I'm trying to find reasons why it is not very relevant. I'm trying to say that the new information doesn't really matter or doesn't change the original forecast much. So I'm being conservative. So subsequent information is ignored and original information or information that was used to make the first forecast is overemphasized in this bias. Second bias is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when you place extra emphasis on information that supports your belief. Or in other words, you tend to notice only information that agrees with your perception or your belief. You ignore information or you understate information that conflicts or contradicts your thesis. So confirmation bias, he will notice only the positive things that emerge in the rest of the external world. He will ignore the negative things. Representativeness bias happens because people form heuristics. So if you are with the representativeness bias, then you will think Infosys is a good company or Infosys is a good stock. So just because a particular company is a good company, the analyst feels it is a good stock. So because the management shares information, the management pays dividends, the management has no pending court cases against it, so we say that the company is good, and we say that the stock is good. So good companies are good stocks. It's a very common representativeness bias in the market. A good company may or may be the worst stock, because the performance of the stock depends not just upon the company but also on the valuation. So it may be a good company, but the stock has already been overvalued and been given the benefit of that good company. Now the stock will underperform on the slightest bad news or even the expectation of a bad news. Whereas a bad company may be the best stock because the bad company is battered down and the valuations have become so inexpensive. So representativeness bias makes us form heuristics that if this happens, then this. If the stock has gone up for 10 days, then it will go up in the 11th day also. Or then it will fall in the 11th day. Is a heuristic. So heuristics are rules of thumb that people derive from their experience. Because these heuristics are wrong, people can commit investment errors. So understand conservatism, confirmation, representativeness, illusion of control, also called the control bias. So indeed, individuals feel that they have more control over their outcomes than they actually have. So they think that they can completely determine the return of their portfolio, that external factors don't matter. The performance of the portfolio is only dependent on my intelligence. So what will they try to do? They try to trade too much. Or when the stock, they will sell on every rise, buy on every fall. They try because they feel that they control the things too much. When the truth is that they may have the job of managing the portfolio, but there are certain events that are outside their control. So trying to overmanage or trying to manage everything is not going to help the cause. Hindsight bias happens when people too simplistically explain the past. Okay, they simply or are very easily able to explain the past. So what has happened is that forecast has gone wrong. The forecast has gone wrong, there has to be a mistake. However, rather than doing a thorough analysis and finding out where the mistake was in the portfolio management process, what people will do is that, oh okay, only if I had put a little more weight on the price earnings ratio would my forecast have been correct. So they explain the past too simply, and hence they do not adequately recalibrate their models. People who are suffering from hindsight bias will see that, okay, only if I made these adjustments to my model would have been right. Rather than doing a thorough analysis and understanding that no, it is because things are beyond his control and modeling only has limited usability. You must accept the restrictions. They will say that no, the model is pretty much correct. There are just slight mistakes. I have fixed the mistakes. Now we can use the model for the future. So they will continue making mistakes. So there are 5 cognitive biases: conservatism, confirmation, representativeness, control bias or illusion of control, and hindsight bias. So that's the first category of cognitive biases which arise due to belief perseverance or people's efforts to avoid cognitive dissonance. The second set of cognitive biases occur because of processing errors. Okay, so because we don't want to make the effort, or we don't have the ability to make the entire effort and the entire information to conduct an analysis and make a forecast. So the first type of processing error is anchoring and adjustment, very similar to conservatism. So when affected by anchoring and adjustment, analysts are anchored to a particular value, that is a particular target price, a previous earnings forecast. So anchoring and adjustment is like conservatism, that is, even though new information has come, the analyst is not ignoring the information like in conservatism. He is identifying, or he is accepting the information, but he is not fully incorporating it in his estimate. So if the estimate should have been revised from 5 to 10, the analyst is revising it only from 5 to 8. So in the exam, how will you tell whether the bias is anchoring or whether it is conservatism? If there is a number associated with it, that he corrects it, he changes it from 5 to 8, target price is brought down but only by 5% rather than 10%. So if there is a number attached to the statement, normally the bias will be anchoring and adjustment. Okay? If it is a general statement that this statement come but he still ignored and went away, it is normally conservatism, not processing error. He didn't want to. He just didn't want to accept the new information. Here, he wants to accept it, but he doesn't fully give himself. He doesn't process it entirely and adjusts the forecast. The second bias is called mental accounting bias. So mental accounting is similar to what we have studied earlier, that people segregate their goals. Corresponding to each goal, they construct their portfolio and they make their total portfolio into 5 different portfolios. So rather than constructing a diversified portfolio, they may construct 2 concentrated portfolios or over diversified portfolios, because the correlations amongst different sets of goals or different sets of portfolios is not considered. Framing bias is the same. It's again a processing error, because the same information is viewed differently depending on the way it is received or the investor's state of mind when the information is received. Availability bias is pretty interesting. He says that the information that is more easily recalled is placed a higher weight upon. So higher weight on easily recallable information. If information can be easily recalled, I put higher weight. So normally companies, or when management presents their report or management does an earning announcement, you will see good news is presented first. A lot more time is spent on good news, and the bad news, even though it may be very relevant or it may have a very high bearing, is normally understated. So you'll spend only 1 or 2 minutes explaining the bad news, but most of the times is in the good news. Why? Because analysts often suffer from availability bias. They will predict the estimates, or they will make the estimates by information which is most easily recallable. If easily recallable information is good information, then you will end up overvaluing. If easily recallable information is bad information, then you will end up undervaluing if you are suffering from this bias. Loss aversion. Investors exhibit loss aversion rather than risk aversion. So when in a loss, the risk aversion suddenly increases, or rather risk aversion decreases, risk seeking increases. So they want to avoid loss. They would rather prefer a large loss to a small loss. So they want to avoid loss. They first of all never book losses. So if in a loss, he will never set a portfolio, and when in loss, he takes riskier bets. He starts taking riskier bets. My apologies, I should have mentioned. So those are the set of cognitive biases. We now move on to emotional biases, which happen because of psychological predispositions. So the first emotional bias is loss aversion. Okay, it's not a cognitive bias. It's not because of belief perseverance or processing error. It's because of my psychological predispositions. So loss aversion, I don't want to accept a loss. If I'm in a loss, I will take riskier bets and even riskier bets and even more riskier to try to get out of it. So risk aversion increases when in a loss, and investors avoid booking a loss. So he doesn't want to accept a loss. Another emotional bias is the overconfidence bias. Now, in individuals, the overconfidence bias normally comes because of an illusion of knowledge. So analysts are especially susceptible to this bias. They think that they know everything about the stock, or they think that they know more about the others, hence their estimates have to be better. So I met the management, I know the business, I know the costs, so my estimates have to be the best. But there are so many things that are beyond your control. No matter how much knowledge he has about the stock, he cannot predict when an earthquake will happen and that the factory is on an earthquake prone zone. So if a tsunami happens or if an earthquake happens, your knowledge won't matter. But individuals who have fought with overconfidence think that they will be able to exactly predict the returns of the company and the estimates or the earnings of the company, without realizing that there are so many aspects that are outside the gamut of knowledge or prediction. So if you have prediction or overconfidence, you normally underestimate the risk. You may also have certainty overconfidence. So you are certain that the stock is going to go well, it's going to do well, it's going to give you positive returns. So you end up overstating the probability of success. When asked, what are the chances that your estimate will go wrong? Analysts will normally say just about 2%. When actually presented with the different externalities that exist, that so many things can actually go wrong, they will normally increase their number. They will say, okay, yes, actually the probability of going wrong is not 2, it's maybe 4 or 5%. So people underestimate their chances of going wrong, okay, because of overconfidence. So overconfidence leads to narrow confidence intervals. That is, when asked that please give a range of the worst case and best case loss or profit, worst case and best case return of a stock, normally people will give a very narrow range. They'll say -5 to 5. Then when we explain it to them again that no, what we asked was worst possible case and the best possible case. Think about the worst. Worst is the world can come to an end, the worst case. They'll slowly increase it. They'll be like, okay, the worst and the best will be -10 to +10. So when asked the first time, analysts normally construct confidence intervals that are too narrow because they're suffering from overconfidence. Okay, self-attribution bias is another very common bias that leads to overconfidence. So self-attribution comes because people attribute good calls or successes to themselves. You attribute good calls to your ability and your stock picking, your knowledge, but bad calls or mistakes on externalities. The world was wrong or something external happened, I had no control on it. So it can be broken up into self-enhancing bias and self-protecting bias. So take the credit for success and blame the failure on something else. So loss aversion, overconfidence, self-control are emotional biases, guys. In the self-control bias, you end up spending more money than you should be. You fail to balance short-term and long-term savings. Investors who are used to spending a lot or who are suffering from this normally are not able to control their feelings or control their actions, even though they know that it is detrimental to them, but they will end up spending more. Status quo bias is very interesting. It is that unless forced to reevaluate their portfolios, investors just let them be. A very common mistake that defined contribution pension plan participants do, that initially whatever portfolio I constructed, you let it be. Whatever stocks you are owning, whatever bonds you are owning, you keep on owning. Even though your personal circumstances may have changed, your scenarios may have changed, your portfolio may require rebalancing. So unless forced to reevaluate, people will not do. People who are suffering from the status quo bias will not. Endowment bias is another very common emotional bias. So when asked about how much is the price of your house, how much do you think you will be able to sell your house for? People will say $1 million. However, if they are shown exactly the same house and they're asked how much will you pay to buy this house, they'll say $500,000. So when you own the asset, you normally ask for a price that is higher than what you yourself would be willing to pay if you were to buy it. So you have a higher ask and you have a much lower bid. So when you want to buy it, you want to pay a much lower. So what this bias does is people hold on investments too high because they want too high a price for their stocks, which normally never comes. So hence they end up holding losers too long. We'll study the impact of each of these biases in detail. Let's just get a basic understanding of what they're trying to say. Now, one of the most difficult biases to understand, guys, is the regret aversion bias. Okay, understand it's different from loss aversion, it's different from any other bias you studied. This bias is called fear of regret or regret aversion. Okay, it's an emotional bias. So first let's understand the definition of regret. Regret is the feeling in hindsight associated with making a bad decision. Feeling in hindsight associated with making a bad decision. Now, people want to avoid regret. They don't want to look back and feel that I knew it, I still made a mistake, or I made a bad decision. Now, there's a stock. You know that bad news is expected in the stock, is going to come in the particular stock. Will you buy it? You know that the bad news is expected in the particular stock and the stock has corrected 30%, because just like you, everyone else also knows that bad news is expected. Will you buy it? A rational investor would consider, okay, or would probably buy it if he thinks that the bad news is in the price. However, if you are suffering from the regret aversion bias, then you are very scared of the error of commission. You don't want to have a regret from taking an action. So let's assume you buy the stock. It has corrected 30% and you think it's in the stock and you buy it. And then bad news comes and it falls 50% more, or let's say it falls 10% more. Will you have regret? Will you have a feeling that I knew the bad news was going to come, I knew the bad news, still I bought, so I'll be very regretful? Whereas if the bad news comes and the stock doesn't fall, even if you haven't bought it, even if you did buy the stock, that is, you didn't capture the gain, you can still blame that at least I predicted the bad news correctly. The bad news was predicted correctly, the bad news came, market is irrational, or people don't know what they're doing and hence they're buying, the stock has gone up. So everyone is doing it, so you will not have as high a fear of or feeling of regret as you will in the first case. So people don't want to commit the error of commission. That is, they don't want to have a feeling of regret from taking an action. Similarly, there can be an error of omission. Now, a good news is expected in a stock. So will you buy it? Yes. But the stock has already gone up 50% on the expectation of that good news. You still want to buy it because you don't want to miss the good news. You think that the stock will still go up when the good news actually comes. So you don't want to commit the error of omission. That is, not buying the stock, and then when the good news comes and the stock goes up, you will have a feeling of regret. I knew the good news, still I didn't buy. So understand, if the action is being taken to avoid these kind of feelings, then the bias is a fear of regret. Now, as we studied the different types of biases that this chapter tries to explain, now let's understand that what kind of trading behavior will these biases manifest into? Now, what will be the impacts of the biases? Now, if you're suffering from the conservatism bias, what will be the impact? You will be too slow to react to new information. You may hold winners or losers too long because you are ignoring relevant information or you are avoiding relevant information. How should you mitigate, or how can you mitigate this bias in an analyst or in an individual if you know? First of all, make sure, here's the best way first of all to get over any bias is to realize that the bias does exist. If you're aware that the bias can exist, then mitigating it will be easier. The problem why biases don't get corrected is people don't know. Until the time you study behavioral science and you think so much about it, will you come to know that yes, these biases actually exist. Otherwise, you will not come to know only the bias exists. So, to mitigate the conservatism bias, make sure that you have a process in place which mandates careful independent analysis of all new information. If there is some information that you are unable to interpret as whether it is good news or bad news, you must seek the help of an expert. That this news I am unable to expect, so go to an industry specialist or go to a consultant and find out what impact it has on you, rather than just ignoring it and sticking with your original focus and your original beliefs. What happens on the confirmation bias? Again, too much confidence, you are only looking at the good news. So you see the good news and you keep buying more and more of the stock. So you end up overweighting a particular stock because you're ignoring the bad news systematically and buying more into by looking at the good news selectively. So it leads to concentrated portfolios and too much confidence in certain stocks. So how do you mitigate it? Again, actively seek contradicting information. Basically, if you're aware that this bias exists, you will be able to help yourself. So actively seek contradicting information. Use more than one method of analysis in arriving at your targets. Representativeness bias, guys. Okay. Now, representativeness bias can happen because of two things. Let's understand the representativeness bias a little better first. Okay. What is it? That if company has high dividend yield, it is a buy. This statement is an example of a representativeness bias. Okay. Now, there can be two mistakes that you can make, or this statement can be wrong because of two reasons. First of all, the category is wrong. That is, just because some dividend paying stocks have done well doesn't mean all dividend paying stocks will do well. This is called sample size neglect. When from too small a sample you generalize information to all stocks. This is called sample size neglect, guys, or the category is wrong. And the second mistake is you are placing wrong stocks in the category. So one stock this year gave a dividend of very high, a dividend yield of 5%, but it skips dividends in 3 out of 5 years. So when it pays a dividend, it pays a very good dividend, but it does not pay dividends in 3 out of 5 years. So if you see from a 5-year perspective, the dividend payment is very low. So this stock is not a high dividend yield stock. So, but you are putting it in the high dividend yield category. This is called base rate neglect. So 2 mistakes you can make. First of all, the statement itself is wrong. That is, the category is wrong, which is called sample size neglect. And the second case is you're putting the wrong stocks in the category, which is called base rate neglect. So people who have representativeness bias are likely to change strategies too often. So first they think that dividend yield stocks are good. Then they'll see that stocks don't perform well. They'll see that high dividend yield stocks are bad. Growth stocks are good. So if you don't want to do a thorough analysis and from your experience or from short-term occurrences you want to generalize, you will change strategies too often. There will be a lot of churn in your portfolio and associated costs. So to mitigate this kind of bias, what you should do is, rather than quickly placing the information into different categories, do a deeper analysis to find out whether this heuristic is applicable or not. And then use a historic table of returns. See in the history. See over a 10-year period or a 5-year period, how has this heuristic performed? And you will realize that in the last 4 or 5 months it may have given you a return, but if you do a 5-year analysis, it hasn't worked, or it may have given negative returns, very high at that. So if you use a larger sample, a period of returns, you will normally be able to avoid this bias. The illusion of control or control bias results in people trading too much and making concentrated portfolios, because you think you control everything, you decide. So it manifests in a way in overconfidence as well. So you try to take the entire responsibility upon yourself. So you try to overmanage things, thinking that you can decide the returns or you can decide the direction of stocks and the direction of your portfolio, when actually not so much is there in your hands. So excessive trading and lack of diversification are the results of this bias. How do you mitigate it? Understand the true complexity of investing. Easier said than done, but you must realize that things are not so simple. No matter how much you read, no matter whether you are a CFA charter holder or you are a PhD, there will be certain things that will be beyond your control. Seek others' opinions. Keep records to see if you have actually controlled your investment outcomes or not. So if you do these things, you will be able to mitigate this bias. Hindsight bias, guys. Okay, why? What is the problem? You think your model is right. Every time you make a mistake, you just tweak it a little bit and you think that things are fine. So you overestimate the accuracy of your forecasting. So you say that, okay, if I just tweak it like this, it will work perfectly well in the next period. Now I have fixed it. So you overestimate the accuracy and you may take too much risk because you are too confident in your models. Again, keep detailed records. Keep the reasoning behind the record, behind the forecast. So when you make the first forecast, don't just keep the forecast. Keep the reasoning. Why did you give that forecast? So that when the results come, they may be the same as your forecast or they may be different. You know where your reasoning went wrong. And hence, you think more and you calibrate your models better rather than quickly doing a slight tweaking or a slight judgment and saying that the model is correct. Now we move to processing errors. So the first processing error was anchoring and adjustment. So again, the same impact is pretty much the same as that of conservatism, that even with the new information, investors stay with their original forecast. So you may end up holding stocks too long, or you may end up concentrating your portfolios. So to mitigate that, new information must be given thorough consideration. For the mental accounting bias, your portfolios are essentially suboptimal because you have segregated the whole portfolio and you are not accounting for the correlations between the different parts. Eventually all of it is your money. So you must see, or you must construct portfolio from a diversification perspective. So income is considered separate and capital gains are considered separate. Basically both are a part of your return. So if you have a portfolio that is too highly focused on income because you want it to be safe, all your goals are very critical, so you constructed a safe portfolio, all money gone to fixed income securities, lot of coupon came, so much coupon was not required, and the current income gets suboptimally spent, or you end up spending more because of the self-control bias. So sometimes you may end up taking too much risk in the search of high current income. So you want very high coupon paying bonds because you need the income, so you may end up taking too much risk also. So how do you mitigate this bias? Look at the investments as a portfolio and analyze the correlations between different stocks. Framing bias. So information is processed depending on the state that I'm in. So if I'm in a loss, then everything is looking like bad news to me. So when I've already suffered a loss, I don't want to invest in stocks. Even though the market has now fallen 50%, but I had a loss once, so I will never invest in the stock market. I'm in a bad frame of mind. So it may lead to risk aversion, it may lead to risk seeking, it may lead to, so investors may not act rationally or may not act sensibly, rather they may act based on their state of mind or how the information is framed. So to mitigate this bias, focus on overall expected risk and returns rather than just gains or losses. So you may have a gain or you may have a loss, but realize equities have higher risk and they give higher return in the long run. So focus on overall risk and returns rather than short-term gains or losses. Availability bias says that easily recallable information has a higher weight placed on it. Okay, so how do we define easily recallable, or how does the availability bias affect people? First of all, it depends on the retrievability of the information. So availability, the first thing that has got to do with availability is the recallability. So if it is easily recallable, that means it just happened, normally you will end up putting a higher weight in it. If it is a category that you understand, then you will end up putting a higher weight in it. So let's say you are a FMCG analyst. You think because you've studied FMCG stocks all your life, it is a category that you are more familiar with. So you end up overweighting your portfolio more to FMCG securities, even though it may not be warranted. So categories that are more easily available to you or that are more familiar to you, end up investing more in, over-investing in. Now, if you have a narrow range of experience, okay, so if you've entered the market in 2008 and you have 3 years of experience, you will see that FMCG stocks are good because FMCG stocks have always performed well. So because you haven't seen the bad times or you haven't seen the underperformance of a certain set of securities, you underestimate the risk of these securities. You think they'll always perform well because what is available to you is good performance throughout. And finally, individuals tend to estimate others' likes and dislikes using their own. So just because I don't like tobacco doesn't mean tobacco won't sell. I don't like tobacco doesn't mean tobacco stocks are bad. So I won't invest in tobacco stocks. What people tend to do is that others will also not invest in tobacco stocks. That's not the case. Others will invest in tobacco stocks. They may like it. So when you try to resonate, you try to estimate others' likes and dislikes using your own. Okay? Because information available to you or what you want is not necessarily what the market wants. So retrievability, categorization, narrow range of experience, resonance all add to the availability bias. What happens? You invest based on advertising. You may end up owning very few asset classes that you are familiar with. Over-investing in them, portfolios may become under-diversified, and hence the construction may be suboptimal. So how to mitigate? Use a long-term strategic approach. Use an investment policy statement. We will study this in a lot of detail in the coming lectures. And do thorough research. Don't just be dependent on your experience. Use others' experience also. Read research reports. See the history of performances before you decide on a particular investment. So, if you're suffering from loss aversion, you basically don't want to accept a loss. So if you have a current loss-making position, then you take on even more riskier positions to come out of that loss or to mitigate that loss. Another concept that is related to loss aversion is the house money effect. It says companies often take more risk with retained earnings than they would with outside equity. Equity is the same, guys. Same return has to be given to all equity holders, whether that equity is through a fresh issuance or through retained earnings. Normally, if company has just done a fresh issuance or it is external money, companies don't, or they are very careful in investing that money. But if the company or if the earnings are profits that I have made, then the profits I think are my winnings, and hence I am more risk seeking or I am less careful when I am investing the retained earnings. This is called the house money effect. It comes from the casino. So when you go into a casino and let's say you start off with 1,000 rupees and you win 200 rupees. So your total asset base is 1,200. So 200 rupees you consider as free of cost. You become very risky with your 200 rupees without realizing that entire 1,200 is your money. It should be looked at in the same way. So you are very conservative with the 1,000. You were gambling very carefully. But the 200 extra that you got, you became careless with. This is called the house money effect. Myopic loss aversion is also a very important concept. When presented with annual equity returns, if you see the equity returns of any index, so there is negative returns, negative, positive, negative. So short-term returns on equities look very scary. So people try to avoid equities in the short run when presented with short-term performance. This is called myopic loss aversion. Whereas when they are presented with a long-term growth or point-to-point 10-year, 15-year returns, they become much more comfortable and are willing to invest more in securities. So this means that in the short term nobody wants to bear a loss, or they would avoid investments that they think can give them immediate loss. So the impact of this bias, you end up holding losers too long. Rather than basing your decisions on expected risk and expected return, you sell the winners in your portfolio and you keep sticking on to the losers in the hope that they will break even and then you will sell them. Myopic loss aversion may lead to the avoidance of equities as explained. How do you mitigate? Do more fundamental analysis. So just if there is one stock in the portfolio that is worth 100 rupees, whether you should buy it or sell it should depend on the fundamentals on the fair value of the stock. So if the fair value is 200, then don't sell it. If the fair value is 50, then even at 100 you should sell it. Should it matter whether the stock has become 10 to 100 or 1000 to 100? Absolutely not, guys. If you are a rational investor, don't see the performance, don't see 10 to 100. It may have come to 100 from whatever reasons. At 100, the decision to buy or sell should depend on the fundamentals of the stock. If at 100 also you think, or the analysis suggests, an independent fair analysis suggests that it's a buy, you should keep holding it. And if it suggests to sell, you should sell it. How the stock has come to the 100 or the past performance of the stock should not matter in making future decisions. Overconfidence has two very common problems, guys. Your portfolios become under-diversified. You are too confident, you end up owning a few stocks that you think will perform well, and you trade too much. So overconfidence causes excessive trading and under-diversified portfolios, similar to control. Even control causes these problems. Okay? How to mitigate? Keep detailed records of your trades and motivations, and see where you performed well because of luck and where it was your actual reasoning because of which the stock performed well. A lot of times you predicted the stock will go up, and the stock actually goes up. But it has got nothing to do with why you predicted it to go up. It happened for completely different reasons. So understand that your ability to predict is not that high as much as you think. So this is a good solution for a lot of biases, guys. Keep detailed records of trades and motivations. Separate luck from good performance. Self-control bias, you're spending more. You're spending too much money in this case. So not enough savings. So because you don't have enough savings, then to meet your goals, you need to take excessive risk in the future. So the alternative is to consume income but not draw down on the portfolio. This is one of the solutions also. So a good way of mitigating the self-control bias is that I will never sell anything of the portfolio. I will never draw down on the portfolio. If 1000 rupees is what I began with, I will consume only what I get over and above 1000. So I have to keep an amount of 1000 that the income I will consume. If the income is high, maybe I can consume more. If income is less, I will control myself and not consume. But I will avoid drawing down on the portfolio. So how do you mitigate this bias? Define your goals and strategies and do a good budgeting exercise for yourself. In the status quo bias, investors will just don't trade. Investors don't rebalance their portfolio even when their circumstances have changed and warrant rebalancing or certain tweaking. So what happens because of this bias? They will lose out on potentially profitable investment opportunities. So you should educate these clients about risk and return and about proper asset allocation. Endowment bias, you want more, but if you had to buy it, you would pay less. So if you have this kind of bias, you may end up holding assets too long and their value may fall, especially inherited assets. Because when you want to sell them, you want an exorbitantly higher price or a relatively higher price. But if you yourself were to buy them, you were willing to pay a lower price. How to mitigate this bias? Continually check to determine if the asset allocation is appropriate, regardless of how long you have been holding the assets. Okay, so you should see the asset allocation, and that should be the primary driver of whether the asset has to be sold or retained. So if you have too much of a particular asset and you need to diversify, then you need to diversify. You need to sell it, because otherwise your portfolio will become too concentrated. The final emotional bias that we studied was avoid the feeling of regret. As we understood, it may have two impacts. First of all, you don't invest only. Because if you don't invest, there can't be any feeling of regret. So, you be in the low risk investments. Or the second problem may be whenever you invest, you follow the herd. Whatever is good earnings or good stock, you buy. Bad stock that people tell you, you sell because you don't want to have regret. If you go wrong, everyone is going wrong. So you are also losing it. So you may end up not investing at all because you don't want regret, or you may end up following the herd in your investing. So the primary source of mitigation is educating people about valuations, educating that as long as the bad news or the good news is being priced in, it may or may not make sense to trade. Now guys, what does behavioral finance say about investment policy? Investment policy is a guideline that you create for yourself or for your fund managers on how assets should be invested. So what does behavioral finance say about investment policy and asset allocation? We studied this before, that people don't look at their portfolio as one. People segregate their goals and then invest based on those goals. So they will have 5 goals in life and they will make 5 different portfolios, each one to make to meet the particular goal. The advantage of this kind of investing is that at least your risks are mitigated, or you know what is the chances or not chances of meeting a particular goal. But the problem is it may not be the best portfolio that you could have constructed because you ignored correlation. Now guys, once we have understood the behavioral biases that people have understood, can suffer from behavioral biases, or people do suffer from behavioral biases. Should we in our allocation, or should we as advisors, as advisors to different people about managing their wealth, should we try to correct the biases? Now, behavioral finance or what portfolio management says is that depends. It depends on certain factors. The higher the wealth of your client, so if your client is a wealthy individual, then you can let him live with the biases. Even if he has some biases and he's investing according to his whims and fancies, it's okay. His risk tolerance is high. So, higher wealth, you can accommodate. You can be more accommodated of the biases. So the asset allocation you don't have to change. But if the client has lower wealth and he is very biased also, then you have to correct it. You have to tell him that no, according to your circumstances, this is not the way to invest. Your money has to be invested in this manner. So you have to be more stringent. Okay? And then how do you go about adjusting for the biases, guys? Normally, cognitive biases you try to mitigate. So you explain to the client that this is what you are doing. You don't have the entire information. He will understand that yes, the advisor has better resources, he has better access, he is in a better position to decide the risk and return and make investments. So normally, client will understand on the cognitive biases. Emotional biases, guys, it will be difficult for you to convince your client. You are better off accommodating it if the client does not understand even after explaining it to him a lot. So mitigate cognitive biases and accommodate emotional biases. Okay, so we'll put some numbers to it, and so for high wealth individuals, okay, for individuals with higher wealth, if he is having cognitive biases, okay, then you should make only modest changes. That is, correct the bias, keep only modest changes. That is, your deviation from a correct allocation should only be 5 to 10%. So if the analyst is having cognitive biases because of which he is constructing an incorrect portfolio, then the deviation should only be 5 to 10%. On emotional biases, you can be more accommodative. You can have even 10 to 15% deviation from your stated bias. For an individual with lower wealth, you have to be more strict. Okay? For an individual with lower wealth, on the cognitive front, okay, first of all, don't allow any, you can explain it. That try and give him education and tell him that he is being biased, so the correct allocation is this. Maximum 0 to 3% deviation is what you should allow. Even on emotional biases, you can be accommodative, but because he has low wealth, you can only allow modest changes, that is only up to 5 to 10% from the prescribed allocation. So to the high wealth individual will normally have a low standard of living risk, and the low wealth individual will have a relatively high standard of living risk. So you can't be as accommodative. Alright guys, let's do a few questions and let's wind it up. So which of the following would most likely be classified as an emotional bias? Which of this is most likely an emotional bias, guys? Has difficulty interpreting complex new information, cognitive bias. This is cognitive. Only partially adjusts forecasts when he receives new information. Okay? This can be anchoring or conservatism. Both are cognitive biases. Has a tendency to value same assets higher if he owns them than if it is the endowment bias, guys. This is a emotional bias. Which of the following would most likely indicate an emotional bias? Again, regularly basing decisions on only a subset of available information. Okay guys, this will be the availability bias. It is a cognitive bias again. Reacting spontaneously to negative earnings announcement by quickly selling the stock. Could be fear of regret. Could be fear of regret because it's a negative earnings, so I want to sell it. So fear of regret is a emotional bias. B is a possibility. Let's evaluate. See, these questions will be very difficult, guys. Okay, it will be very grey. It will be very tough to tell one from the other. Okay, so never read all the choices before you go ahead to the next one. Remaining invested in a profitable technology stock, even though new information indicates that its PE ratio is high. Again, it's either conservatism or anchoring. It's very difficult. It's sometimes very difficult to tell amongst the two. So most likely I will go with B, which looks like the fear of regret bias to me, because he doesn't want to hold the stock when there is a negative earnings announcement. Let's do one more question. 20 years ago, Jane Ivy set up her initial asset allocation in her defined contribution plan by placing an equal amount in each asset class and never changing it. Over time, she increased her contribution by 1% per year until she reached the maximum amount allowed by law. Due to her steadfastness and good fortune, coupled with matching funds from her employer, she now finds herself in her early 40s with $1 million retirement account. Which of the following biases does Ivy suffer from, and how should she correct it? Representativeness, make sure the sample size is correct and new information is interpreted correctly. No, there is no if-then heuristic. Okay, representative will be, guys, when there is an if-then. If this happens, then that happens. There is nothing like that. This does not look like representativeness. It actually does look like status quo, because she's following a steady or a straight-on approach for the entire 40 years. She's not changing it, even though her individual circumstances must have definitely changed. She's now retired. So, most likely it looks like the status quo bias. So you should educate the investor on trade-offs between risk and return and proper asset allocation. Is it the availability bias? No. Is she basing a decision on some easily recallable information or some familiarity with certain investments? No, nothing like that is said. So it doesn't look like the availability bias, guys. Okay? Please use your question bank on this topic. The only way to master this topic is by practicing a lot of questions. This topic is grey just like ethics. Okay? It's difficult to tell a right answer from the wrong. It can get very confusing. The way to mitigate your risk is practice. Thanks a lot, guys. And we'll study the remaining part of behavioral finance and more of private wealth management next time.